Jon Snow stood upon the windswept ramparts of Castle Black, his black cloak snapping in the icy gusts that bore down from the far north. On this crisp morning, the air felt somehow charged, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 possibilities upon its cold currents. His gloved hands rested on the stone battlements, fingers curling against the rough surface, and for a moment he was not the boy who had yearned for recognition all his life. In that single breath, he was the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and he bore that burden with a solemn dignity that came from lessons learned in the bitterest of ways. He turned his eyes skyward, squinting against a watery sun that refused to warm him, then allowed his gaze to sweep along the vastness of the wall. From this vantage, the top of the ancient ice barrier stretched out in both directions like an endless path laid through the heavens. He felt the hush of it, the unspoken promise that here, everything he did mattered, life or death, victory or defeat, all balanced on the thin edge of fate. He had never expected to be here. Though he had once dreamed of heroics and honor, the reality of commanding the Night's Watch had swiftly buried any illusions in the harsh truth of duty. He was Jon Snow, once a nobody in his own father's halls, then a brother among 1,000 sworn to protect the realms of men. And yet, in these uncertain times, another truth had risen. He was not alone. Word had come down from the south that his half-brother, Robb Stark, now king in the north in all but name, would stand in full support of the Night's Watch. Supplies, men, tactical coordination. It was all part of a measured alliance that had never been formalized before, for House Stark had always respected the Watch's neutrality. But now the world was changing, and with it, the old traditions that once bound everyone in place. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He tried not to dwell on how improbable it all felt. Robb Stark was marching through the Riverlands, forging alliances with nobles who still looked askance at the crown. Yet every raven from the king in the north ended with a personal message to Jon. "Do what needs doing, brother, and the north will answer." It was a promise of steel and bread, of men and respect, something that the Night's Watch, diminished in number and in spirit, desperately needed. And so Jon had taken on a heavy mantle of leadership, for he had watchers at every gate, outriders scanning the horizon, supply lines re-established with northern lords who were all too aware of threats from beyond the wall. A horn blasted once from the courtyard below, signaling the arrival of riders at the main gate. Jon exhaled, tension knotting in his chest. It was always a guest these days who might come. A merchant with small wares, a letter from a northern lord, or perhaps the rare emissary from the king in the north himself. That last possibility quickened his heart, because every connection, every link to his Stark blood, reminded him that his father's words had been the bedrock of his life. Ned Stark was gone, but the memory lingered, urging him on. He descended the broad stairs cut from the ice, his breath turning to mist before him. The clang of steel and the low murmur of conversation filled the training yard, where new recruits went through the paces of learning how to hold a sword properly, how to thrust, parry, and endure. He offered a short nod to the master-at-arms, who barked at a gawky youth to tighten his stance. Crossing the yard, Jon spotted Samwell Tarly hurrying in his direction, cheeks red from the cold, clutching a scroll in one hand. "Jon," Sam called, nearly stumbling over a bit of uneven ground. "There's a party from House Mormont at the gate. Lady Meage's nephew or some cousin. I can't remember exactly, but they're from Bear Island, and they're saying they've brought provisions. Stannis's men helped them cross the gift, I believe." Jon couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then let's welcome them," he said, "and see what news they bring." He motioned for Sam to follow. They strode together out to the main gate where the portcullis had been raised. A small column of heavily fur-clad riders entered, leading mules laden with salted fish, barrels of preserved meats, and heavy sacks that undoubtedly contained grains. The rider at the front had a fierce look about him, though he was likely only in his late 20s. He dismounted with a grunt and bowed in a manner that seemed half courtesy, half habit. "Lord Commander Snow," he greeted, meeting Jon's dark eyes with an expression of guarded respect. "I'm Thorin Mormont, nephew to Lady Meech. She's sent what she can spare. Our numbers are thin with so many men riding south with the king in the north. But Bear Island doesn't forget the watch. Jon inclined his head. We are grateful for your support, Thorin Mormont. The watch remembers its friends. Your supplies will help us through the winter. Thorin straightened, eyeing Jon openly. We've heard you're the one now, Commander. Even heard some men say you're a Stark by heart. Jon swallowed any defensiveness he felt rising in him. I'm a Snow by name, and I've sworn my life to the Watch. But House Stark and the North have always been close to us. Thorin gave a short nod, as though satisfied. I respect that. Jon asked for a steward to show Thorin and his men where they could unload. The Mormont men began to disperse, leading their mules deeper into the courtyard. Sam parted ways to check the inventory, and in that moment, Jon felt a peculiar warmth in the midst of the cold. It was the sense that for once, the Night's Watch was not standing utterly alone. More to the point, his identity, so long half in the shadows, was now helping to forge a stronger bond with the Northmen who recognized the Stark blood flowing in his veins, legitimized or not. He left the courtyard behind and took the stairs up the south-facing side of the wall once more. He wanted to see for himself any sign of the next challenge on the horizon. The frost underfoot crackled like brittle bones, and he paused briefly at one of the small archways along the top to survey the wilderness beyond. The sun hung low, painting the sky in thin streaks of pale gold. He glimpsed movement near the tree line, likely a patrol returning or a herd of elk rummaging for what little grass remained under the snow. No threat, not yet, but Jon knew threats were only a matter of time. Mance Rayder, once a brother of the Watch, now king beyond the wall, was out there uniting the free folk. Reports trickled in that the wildlings were gathering in greater numbers than ever before. That fact alone was enough to keep Jon awake at night, for the Watch had not the strength it once had. Every sword counted. Every ally counted. And so Jon had sent word to Robb, letting him know the seriousness of the situation. For centuries, the conflicts north of the Wall had been an afterthought to most Southerners, but the Starks had always known better. A few hours later, Jon was seated in the Lord Commander's solar, a modest room of stone and timber that had once belonged to Jeor Mormont. A brazier burned in the corner, offering faint relief from the chill. On the table before him lay several parchments, supply counts, duty rosters, and a letter bearing Robb Stark's seal, a gray dire wolf on white. Jon was alone, his senses wrapped in the hush of crackling flame and the distant howl of wind. He ran a thumb over the raised sigil on the wax, recalling the last words scrawled therein. We will give the Watch all it needs. The North stands firm. Time is precious, brother. Do not hesitate if you need more men. Jon sighed and set the letter down. Since his elevation to Lord Commander, he'd felt the weight of every life under his command. Men looked to him with expectation, and he felt compelled to prove himself worthy of their trust. He thought often of Lord Eddard Stark, his father in all but name, and of the quiet dignity the man carried, no matter the burdens. Jon wondered if he could ever truly measure up. A rap at the door interrupted his brooding. Enter, he called. The door swung open to reveal Ser Alliser Thorne, his gaunt face as severe as the winter outside. Though once Jon's harshest critic, Thorne had been forced to accept the ascension of this young crow to Lord Commander. His loyalty was tested daily, yet he performed his duties as if determined to prove that the Night's Watch was bigger than any personal feud. Lord Commander, Ser Alliser said stiffly. Another raven. It came from Moat Cailin. The outriders from the king in the North's host, or so it says. He extended the small parchment. Jon took the message, scanning the lines. His eyes widened slightly. More men are coming to Castle Black, he said slowly. A small group at first, but a larger contingent is promised. If that's true, we could have an additional 50 men by next moon's turn. Perhaps more. Thorne's lips pressed thinly. I'm sure we'll put them to good use. The yard is overcrowded as it is, yet I suspect we'll find a corner for them. Jon looked up. A corner, indeed. We'll house who we can in the towers. If these men are from the north, they won't mind a little cold. We need every able-bodied fighter on the wall. The free folk are gathering, and we still have so few rangers to keep watch. Are the patrols back? All but one, Thorne answered. The last patrol was scheduled to return by nightfall. They've been delayed. Jon frowned, though he tried to temper his concern. Nightfall has nearly come. If they haven't returned soon, we may need to send a search party. Keep me informed, Ser Alliser. Of course, Lord Commander, came the curt reply before Thorne pivoted on his heel and departed. Jon leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The logs in the brazier shifted, sending sparks dancing upward. If a patrol had been delayed, it could mean anything: an unexpected storm, a run-in with a band of wildlings, or even something more sinister. Memories of the whites he had once encountered still haunted him like living nightmares. The dead walked, and no matter how many times he told himself he was prepared for that possibility, the idea still sent a shiver down his spine. That was the true threat, more than Mance or any living army. If only the rest of Westeros realized it. As dusk fell, Jon gathered a small party of his most reliable men, Ed Tollett, Gren, and a few others who could be trusted to handle themselves beyond the wall. They rode out through the castle gate, torches lit against the deepening twilight. The forest that clung to the base of the wall stood dark and foreboding, the massive weirwoods and pines seeming to shift in the flickering torchlight. Snow crunched under the hooves of their garrons, and every so often a crow croaked overhead, a shadow against the faint glow of moonlight. They found the missing patrol about 2 miles east of the main path, near the ruins of an abandoned wildling camp. 2 of their brothers lay dead, stiffened by the cold. The survivors, 3 in all, knelt with haunted faces beside the bodies, hands stained red where they had tried to stanch mortal wounds. Gren, dismounting first, asked, "What happened?" One of the survivors looked up, eyes wide. "Wildlings. They came out of nowhere, rags and bones, half-starved, but desperate. We think they might have split from Mance Raido's main host. We fought them off, but..." Jon felt a cold knot in his gut. Another skirmish, more proof that the free folk were moving in all manner of small groups as well as larger forces. He knelt beside the bodies. These men, they had pledged their lives for the realm, and the realm would likely never know their names. Gently, he closed their eyes and took a moment in silence to honor them. "We'll bring them back to Castle Black," he said quietly. "They deserve a proper pyre, at least." They worked together to carry the dead onto a makeshift sled. The living men mounted their horses in a shroud of grief, their heads bowed as if in apology to the frozen wilderness. Jon led the procession back, his mind churning with renewed urgency. Even a small band of wildlings posed a threat these days, for they were cornered by winter and the promise of horrors to come. The free folk were fleeing something far worse than knights or lords. Jon knew that, but it didn't change the reality that they would kill his men if forced. Back at Castle Black, the funeral pyres were lit, and the smell of smoke and burning cloth drifted into the starry night. Jon stood beside the flames, remembering these men by name, reciting the vow under his breath. Nearby, Sam tried not to cry. He had known one of the fallen men well. The others stood silent, half lost in their own thoughts. That night, Jon barely slept. He dozed at his desk, his face pressed against parchment, dreaming of pale blue eyes and an army of the dead marching through the snow. When he jerked awake, he found the candle had burned out, leaving him in darkness. He took a moment to collect himself, then rose stiffly. Dawn was perhaps an hour away, so he paced the corridors of Castle Black, letting the cold stone underfoot remind him that he was still alive. Morning brought new tasks, as it always did. Jon convened with Maester Aemon, whose voice was weaker now but whose mind remained sharp. The old man sat by a brazier in his chambers, eyes filmed with age but turned toward Jon with a quiet respect. "You look troubled, Lord Commander," Maester Aemon said gently. Jon hesitated to burden him, but there was no point in hiding. "We lost 2 men last night. Wildlings, half-starved and desperate, attacked them. And that's not the first such report. Mance Rayder gathers his people at an alarming pace, but bands of stragglers roam at will. The North will send men, so Robb says, but the question is whether they'll arrive in time." Aemon's thin hands clasped over the folds of his robe. "Have hope, Jon. The realm is waking to our danger. You have done more to unite the North behind the Watch than any commander in a generation." Jon tried to smile. "It just feels too slow. Every day, more wildlings cross our path. If the rumors are true, Mance means to bring them all through the wall. He'll stop at nothing." The old maester's milky eyes flickered toward the brazier's glow. "When I was young, Aegon V sat the Iron Throne, and I believed the world was simpler. But war and winter make everything complicated. Jon, you must keep your faith in the bonds you have forged. Your brother has not abandoned you." Jon nodded. "I know." He paused, uncertain if he should voice his deeper dread. Maester, the others, have you heard anything more of them? Eamon's voice grew soft. Only whispers, my boy. The wildlings fear them. Their stories are old, rooted in truth. But so few south of the wall believe. Jon drew in a long breath. Then I must prepare for everything. Because if the others come, words on parchment from southern lords won't save us. Eamon said nothing more, but there was a grave understanding in his expression. They lingered in shared silence for a moment before Jon bade the old man farewell and left to oversee the day's tasks. By midday, fresh snow drifted from leaden clouds covering the courtyard in a white blanket that crunched underfoot. The new recruits and senior brothers alike drilled relentlessly with swords and spears, their breath misting in the cold. Jon spotted the Bear Island men storing supplies under the watchful eye of a steward, their gruff voices carrying on the wind. He wanted to see how the new arrivals integrated. So he approached them, nodding a greeting to the man called Thorin Mormont. Thorin leaned on a crate, arms folded, his breath coming in visible puffs. So, Lord Commander, Thorin said, breaking into a half-smile, when do we see real action? Jon considered the question. As soon as we have a plan, he said. You've come a long way. Let your men rest, get familiar with the place. There'll be a chance to prove yourself soon enough. A tall, raw-boned man with a scar across his cheek spoke up. We didn't ride all this way just to sit by the fire. Jon suppressed a grin. You might be thankful for a warm fire yet. The north can be generous, but the wall is less forgiving. Still, I won't argue with your eagerness. We need men like you. Thorin studied him. We heard rumors that Robb Stark, king in the north, some say plans a grand offensive against the Lannisters. That's got half of our island's men away from home. Those of us left are mostly volunteers looking to do our part. Jon felt a twinge of pride at the mention of Robb. We're grateful. In the days to come, we'll need every hand to help slow the wildlings and protect these realms. I won't lie to you, it'll be dangerous. The free folk aren't our only foes. Thorin's scarred companion spat on the ground. I'd rather face 1,000 wildlings than Lannister crossbowmen. At least the wildlings give you a clean fight. Jon nodded, though he did not entirely agree. You'll have your chance to test that theory soon. For now, rest and eat. Training resumes in the morning. As he turned to go, Thorin caught his eye. One last thing, how do you mean to handle Mance Rayder? Jon hesitated. I mean to hold the wall against him as the Night's Watch has always done. If Mance tries to breach the wall, we'll meet him with steel and vigilance. Thorin tipped his head in acknowledgement, though an uncertain glint flickered in his eyes. Jon left them to their tasks. Another set of footprints trod lightly behind him, and he glanced over his shoulder to see Sam hurrying to catch up. Jon, there's a raven from the Dreadfort, Sam announced breathlessly. Roose Bolton's men confirmed that the king in the north is marching west, but he's promised a detachment for Castle Black. Could be as many as 100 men, but they'll take time. They're currently engaged near the Twins or something like that. Jon's heart lifted fractionally. Good. I only pray they arrive soon. Word is spreading that the wildlings are on the move again, not just stragglers but larger groups. Let's see if we can glean any more specifics from our own rangers. Yes, of course, Sam said, shifting the parchment in his hands. Also, there was a note from Lady Celis Baratheon, Stannis' wife. She wants to know if the Watch will support her husband's claim if he triumphs in the south. It's all quite complicated. Jon grimaced. We don't take sides, Sam. The Watch is meant to remain neutral, but we need their help too. Remind Lady Celis that we are sworn only to guard the realms of men, that we are grateful for any assistance, but that we make no oaths to any king. Sam nodded quickly. Right? I'll prepare a reply. They made their way across the yard toward the old library where the ravens were kept and Sam had established his nest of scrolls and books. A swirl of snow gusted around them, and Jon thought of the enormity of the wars beyond the wall and in the south. Yet here he stood, balanced between them like a man on a tightrope, with the fate of the realm in his hands. Winter was coming, indeed, and the realm needed unity more than ever. If only the political squabbles could be set aside long enough to confront the real danger. Days slid into weeks, each sunrise bringing new scouts, new challenges, and the slow trickle of additional forces from the north. Houses Glover, Serwyn, and Tallheart each sent a handful of men, stout, grim-faced fellows who stared at the vast wall with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Jon spent his RS drilling them, assigning them watch posts, and ensuring they learned from veterans like Ed Tollett how to survive in these harsh conditions. Every new face that arrived reminded Jon that Robb was making good on his promise, that the bonds of brotherhood extended beyond the Watch's black cloaks. Yet the sense of impending violence loomed ever larger. The nights grew longer, the darkness deeper. Reports came of a wildling host massing near the Frostfangs, readying for a push eastward toward the Shadow Tower. Jon's brow furrowed as he listened to the ranger's accounts. Mance Rayder was cunning. If he aimed a feint at the Shadow Tower, perhaps the real blow would come at Castle Black. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Meanwhile, more animals turned up dead in the wilderness, stripped clean of flesh in ways that did not speak of normal predators. Finally, one crisp afternoon, a horn blast echoed along the wall, twice. Wildlings sighted. Jon hurried to the gatehouse, ascending the steps 2 at a time to reach the lookout post. There, a ranger peered through a battered far eye, his breath clouding the lens. "What do you see?" Jon demanded, heart pounding. The ranger handed the far eye over without a word. Jon lifted it, focusing on a dark blur near the distant tree line. He saw movement, dozens of figures moving in loose formation. The wind carried their faint cries, too distant to interpret. Jon felt a twist in his gut. This was more than a ragged group of scavengers. It was an organized band, armed with spears and axes, accompanied by beasts of burden dragging crude sleds. They were perhaps 2 miles out, heading slowly but resolutely toward the wall. Jon lowered the glass. "Sound the alarm. Ready the archers. Let's see if they come in peace or war." A part of him hoped they were simply refugees, seeking to negotiate passage away from the terror that lurked deeper north. But he knew the free folk rarely came so openly unless they were sure of their strength. The courtyard bustled within minutes, black-cloaked brothers lining the ramparts with bows, the fresh recruits from northern houses donning boiled leather and checking their weapons. Jon took a position on the wall walk overlooking the gate. The wildlings drew close, halting just beyond arrow range. Their leader, a tall figure cloaked in white furs, raised a horn to his lips and blew once. A challenge or an invitation? Jon steeled himself. He lifted an arm, signaling for no arrows to be loosed yet. In the hush that followed, a voice called out from below in the old tongue, though the words were too garbled to make out at first. Sam joined Jon with a flush of nerves in his cheeks. They seem to be asking for parley, Jon. I can pick out a few phrases about wanting safe passage. Jon glanced at him. Will they submit to the watch? Sam swallowed hard. That I can't say. Jon exhaled, stepping back. He motioned for the gate to stay closed, then signaled an escort to follow him down. It would be dangerous to step out beyond the gate, but if these wildlings truly wanted to talk, he owed them that much courtesy. War could wait a few minutes, at least. As he walked to the main gate, Ed Tollett and Thorin Mormont accompanied him, swords at the ready. The gate's iron bars were lifted just enough for them to pass. Jon's breath came quicker in the cold air, and he kept a steady hand on Longclaw's hilt. Outside, the landscape stretched white and gray, the scent of pine and ice thick in the wind. They approached the wildling party at a measured pace, stopping about 20 yards away. The tall leader stepped forward, pushing back a fur hood to reveal a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her auburn hair. Her face was lined with age and weather, and she studied Jon with piercing blue eyes. I'm Val, she said in a lilting accent. We come from the camp of Mance Rayder. Jon's pulse quickened at the name. What do you want here? Val's gaze flicked to Jon's black cloak, the dire wolf pommel of his sword. We want to pass the wall. Winter drives us south, and darker things than cold chase us. Mance sends an offer, let us through without bloodshed. We'll do no harm to your precious realm if we can simply survive. Jon heard the subdued desperation in her voice, but also the unwavering determination. He considered his words carefully. The wall isn't just a line on a map. It's our defense against anything that threatens the realm. If you want passage, you must lay down your arms, vow never to raise them against the realm. Can you speak for your entire party? Val's lips tightened. I speak for these free folk. But Mance wants more than safe passage. He wants a place for all his people. That's thousands, Lord Commander. Jon swallowed. And Mance himself? Val's gaze sharpened. He leads as he must. He's not here. But he wants you to consider that letting us through is better than trying to fight us all. You cannot kill us all, Jon Snow. Even with your new friends in black. The mention of new friends, perhaps she'd heard rumors of the northern men bolstering the watch. Jon felt a chill, as though she could see right through him. Val, you know the watch does not bend. If Mance wants true parley, he should come in person. But understand this, an entire wildling horde cannot simply walk through the gates of the realm without conditions. Her lips curled. Conditions? Freedom doesn't come with conditions, Crow. Jon forced himself not to bristle. I speak to you as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, sworn to protect the realms of men. If you want my help, you must be willing to negotiate. Otherwise, there is only conflict. She studied him for a long moment. Mance is no fool. He knows your situation, knows you are short on numbers, but not so short that you can't make us bleed. Let me take your words back to him. For now, we ask only to bury our dead to the east, beyond that ridge. Will you let us do that? Jon inclined his head. He saw no reason to deny a simple burial. We won't interfere with that. But if you move closer to the wall in greater numbers, we will respond. Val nodded, stepping back. We will return to our camp and I will carry your words to Mance. If he decides to parley, we will send another messenger. But time is short, Crow. Winter's breath is already upon us. Jon said nothing more, simply turning to walk away with Ed and Thorin at his side. He could feel Val's gaze upon his back, and it took every ounce of will not to look over his shoulder. Inside, he felt torn. He knew the free folk were not all monsters, and many of them were fleeing a threat even worse than southern armies. But how could he convince the Watch or the rest of Westeros to allow them safe passage? The thought flickered across his mind that if Robb knew the extent of this threat, he might negotiate something. But would the Lords of the North or the South ever accept it? So many had lost kin to wildling raids over the years. Compassion was a rare flower in the stony soil. The moment he was back within Castle Black, the gates sealed behind him with a groan of wood and iron. Jon conferred with Ed and Thorin, summarizing what was said. Word spread quickly that Mance Raido's envoy had come, and men whispered about a great gathering of wildlings. Rumors twisted, some saying they were a horde of cannibals, others warning of giants and monstrous beasts. Jon refuted the more outlandish tales where he could, but fear had a way of gaining traction in a place as cold and austere as the wall. Night fell, and the torches burned bright on the ramparts. Jon climbed to the top once more, scanning the dark horizon. He could make out the faint glow of distant fires, likely the wildling camp. The magnitude of what lay ahead weighed heavily on him. Even if Robb's reinforcements arrived soon, would it be enough to hold back tens of thousands of free folk if Mance truly attacked? And that was to say nothing of the other threat. A few days later, another raven arrived from Robb himself, full of urgency. The king in the north was redirecting a portion of his host to reinforce Castle Black, intending to slow the wildlings before they could break south. Jon's heart soared at the news. Perhaps they had a chance, though it risked thinning Robb's forces in his war against the Lannisters. The letter ended with a simple line, "Winter or war, we stand with you, brother." Those words echoed in Jon's mind as a small contingent of northern cavalry appeared at the gate a week hence, bearing the dire wolf banner. Leading them was a tall man with brown hair and a gentle face. He introduced himself as Lord Medgar Serwyn's cousin, bearing instructions to support the Watch. Soon after, men from House Hornwood and House Manderly arrived, each pledged to join the fight against the wildling threat. Though not numerous, they brought skilled swords, strong arms, and a willingness to follow Jon's command in matters of northern defense. Together, they devised a plan to strike out at the edges of the wildling host, harassing foragers, cutting off supply lines. Robb's letter had urged coordination, trusting Jon's knowledge of the terrain and of wildling strategies. More ravens flew between Castle Black and the scattered fortresses along the wall. The tension mounted with each passing day as men prepared themselves for the possibility of open conflict. Yet as the weeks rolled on, the wildlings themselves remained curiously still. Mance's main host did not surge toward the wall as quickly as Jon had anticipated. Rangers reported sightings of large gatherings further west, near the Fist of the First Men, but the expected wave of free folk never came. Jon wondered if Mance was biding his time or if something else had delayed him. He sent out more rangers, urging them to be cautious. Each day, Jon woke wondering if he would see a massive horde on the horizon, but the horizon stayed mostly empty. In the meantime, the Night's Watch and the northern reinforcements took advantage of the lull to fortify. At Jon's direction, archers practiced in rotating shifts, forming groups with both the Watch and the new arrivals. The men from House Manderly in particular proved adept, having experience hunting waterfowl and game in the White Knife region. Jon worked with them personally, demonstrating vantage points along the wall's ramparts and how best to compensate for the wind shear above the ice. Ser Alliser Thorne kept the new arrivals in line with his usual stern discipline, making it clear that, while they might be loyal to Robb Stark within the walls of Castle Black, the Watch had final authority. The friction was minimal. Most of the Northerners respected the Watch's neutrality, especially under the command of one with Stark blood. A sense of guarded camaraderie began to form. Men shared stories around the braziers at night, tales of battles in the south, close calls with wildlings, and the fear of whatever lay beyond in the deep north. The name White Walkers surfaced time and again in hushed murmurs, though few believed in them wholeheartedly. Jon heard some men joking about them, insisting the real threat was the Lannisters or the Ironborn or whoever had last cut them off in trade. He wished he could share their skepticism, but he knew better. Robb's next letter arrived on a blustery morning. It bore tidings that Walder Frey remained an uncertain ally, that the Boltons were watchful, but the Umbers had pledged to send more men as soon as they could. Jon read the letter aloud to a small gathering of the Watch's officers and the northern leaders who had joined them. The concluding line struck him again. Let us give the southern lords a reason to respect the Watch. Show them what northern steel can do. The men in the room murmured in approval, a few grim smiles all around. In the following days, Jon intensified scouting missions to the west, determined to confirm the wildlings' position. One evening, 2 rangers came galloping back, exhausted and half-frozen, but alive. They reported that Mance's main host was indeed encamped near a place called the Milkwater, thousands strong with tents that stretched beyond counting. Giants had been sighted, along with mammoths, which the free folk might use to breach the wall's gates. It was a fearsome sight, they said, but the camp showed signs of turmoil, arguments, scattered fires, and unusual quiet at night. One ranger claimed he saw fires burning bright in the far distance, as if some other force roamed the snowy plains. Jon's mind raced. Was Mance's delay due to internal strife or something else? The Watchers also spoke of seeing wildlings carrying bodies, but they were not certain whether it was from disease or from attacks by whites. A shadowy dread gnawed at Jon. The undead might already be stirring, harassing the wildling flanks. If that were true, it could change everything. Perhaps Mance would be forced to strike the wall sooner rather than later, driven by desperation to escape the threat behind him. So Jon made a decision: he would lead a mission west to gather more reliable intelligence. He couldn't afford to wait for Mance to appear on Castle Black's doorstep with mammoths and giants at the ready. He called for volunteers, and to his surprise, several of the newly arrived northern men stepped forward along with his own brothers. Among them was Thorin Mormont, who insisted that if Bear Island men were to fight, they ought to have the best information possible. They prepared supplies, readied horses, and set out the next dawn, a column of 20 riders forging through the snow-laden forest paths that meandered along the northern side of the wall. It was a treacherous journey, bitterly cold with snowdrifts that reached their horses' flanks in places. The Watchers' huts at intervals were abandoned or manned by skeleton crews, each reporting small skirmishes with wildling scouts. Once or twice, Jon and his men found bodies, both black cloaks and wildlings frozen in grotesque poses. Still they pressed on, mindful of every snapped twig and silent clearing. On the 4th night, they made camp in the ruins of a small holdfast that had once served as an outpost. The walls stood half-collapsed, but the stone provided some shelter from the howling wind. Jon sat with Thorin Mormont near a modest fire, scanning the darkness beyond. Sleep was elusive, every gust of wind sounding like a ghostly footstep. What do you truly believe of these others? Thorin asked quietly, turning a piece of charred meat over the flames. Some men say you've seen them, that you know the dead walk. Jon hesitated, feeling the old chill. I've seen a white. It used to be a ranger I knew. It rose again in the night, tried to kill the Lord Commander. Steel doesn't stop them. Only fire. I wish it weren't true, but it is. Thorin considered this in grim silence. Then how can we stand against such a thing? We stand together, Jon said simply. All the living. That's what I'm trying to make people see. Thorin's gaze flicked away. The North may respect the Watch more now, thanks to you and your brother, but not all believe these tales. Some think it's just wildling stories. Jon sighed. They'll see soon enough. Winter is here, or near enough. When it fully arrives, the truth will become impossible to ignore. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. The night stretched on, and Jon took his turn at watch, pacing the perimeter with his sword half-drawn, eyes scanning the snowy darkness. His mind drifted back to the halls of Winterfell, to a time when he was just a boy looking at a future with little hope of greatness. Now, that boy was gone, replaced by a man weighed down with the fate of many. He was Lord Commander in an era where the old ways were shifting, and it both terrified and emboldened him. They rose early the next morning, pressing onward. By midday, the scouts at the front signaled for Jon to join them. He spurred his horse, riding ahead to the crest of a small ridge overlooking a wide, frozen valley. Below lay a sight that made his heart skip a beat, a wildling camp, or what remained of one. Tents lay torn or collapsed, the snow stained a dark maroon in scattered patches. Horses and wolves lay dead in drifts. Bodies huddled in contorted shapes, some half-buried. A faint trail of footprints led away, heading deeper west. Jon dismounted, carefully descending into the abandoned camp. Thorin Mormont followed, grim-faced. The stench hit them, decay and something sharper, an acrid scent that burned the nostrils. The men spread out, searching for survivors or clues. In the center of the camp they found the most disturbing sign, a ring of corpses arranged in a pattern, limbs twisted unnaturally, eyes wide with terror. It was as though they'd been placed there deliberately, maybe by the others or by wildling shamans. Jon couldn't say. He had seen something like this once before, after the remains of a scouting party had been found to the north of the wall. It was a calling card, a warning, or both. 7 hells, one of the northern men murmured, going pale. What could do this? Jon steeled himself. The others. Or they're whites. Or maybe something in service to them. We can't stay here. Let's see if there are any survivors. They found none alive. A single dying horse kicked feebly, eyes wide with pain. One of Jon's men swiftly put it out of its misery. The hush lay thick, disturbed only by the wind. Jon's heart pounded as he surveyed the carnage. If Mance's camp had been hit by something like this, it could force his hand. Desperate free folk would be coming, in numbers beyond counting. The Watchers had been right, something was driving them. This place is cursed, muttered a voice. Another man retched behind a torn tent. Jon understood the sentiment well enough. He motioned for the men to gather. We move on, he said firmly. We head back east and warn Castle Black. Mance isn't the only threat. His eyes flicked around the faces of men who had volunteered for an ordinary scouting expedition. They had not bargained for the horrors they were seeing. Burn what bodies we can, then we ride. They quickly set to work, piling the dead in heaps before dousing them in oil and lighting them aflame. Black smoke rose into the gray sky, carrying the stench of charred flesh. Jon watched with grim determination, knowing they had no time to linger. The living needed to be warned. By day's end, they set off at a fast pace, hearts pounding with every snap of a twig behind them. Their return to Castle Black was harrowing. Once near dusk, they were trailed by figures that moved too silently to be simple beasts. Jon feared an ambush, but nothing materialized, perhaps because the creatures, if they were creatures, shunned the flickering torches. Eventually, the familiar silhouette of the wall loomed in the distance, a pale blue giant against the twilight. Relief seeped into Jon's veins, though he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Inside Castle Black, chaos threatened once the news spread. Men whispered of an army of corpses, of unspeakable horrors. Jon convened the senior officers, northern leaders, and Maester Aemon to share every detail. He felt the tension in the room thicken as he spoke of the patterns, the twisted corpses, the possibility of the others. Ser Aliser's face was taut with suppressed dread. Thorin Mormont gave his account, his voice stripped of bravado. Maester Aemon listened without comment, hands folded in his lap. After a weighty silence, Jon addressed them all. Mance Rayder may attack soon, but we face a threat greater than any wildling host. The others are real, and they're close. We must hold the wall at all costs, not only a guy. NST Mance, but against whatever follows him. And the Southern Lords? Asked a Northern Knight, arms folded. Will they hear us now? Jon's jaw clenched. They'll have to. Robb Stark has lent us support. His men are here and more may come. But I fear the South is too entangled in its own war to send a massive force. We must do the best we can with the men we have. Ser Aliser inclined his head grudgingly. And if Mance's horde arrives, do we open the gates? Do we treat them as enemies or potential allies against the others? That question felt like a knife twisting in Jon's chest. If Mance is wise, he'll treat with us. But we can't simply open the gates to an army that might burn half the north. They must bend, or we meet them with steel. Even if they were to aid us against the others, we need terms. Grim nods all around. The meeting broke with a sense of uneasy resolve. The men dispersed to ready themselves for the coming storm, each in his own way. Jon lingered with Maester Aemon as the old man slowly stood. Jon, the Maester said softly, this is a burden heavier than most can bear, but you have not faltered. Remember that in the darkest hour, sometimes the only victory is to stand. Jon felt tears prick behind his eyes, but he forced them back, giving a small bow of respect. Thank you, Maester. Alone in his solar, Jon found Sam waiting, rummaging through a set of old tomes. The poor man looked half frantic. Jon, I've been reading about the long night, about the wards that might have been placed in the wall to keep the others at bay. There are scraps of stories about fire magic or maybe dragonsteel. I'm not sure, but maybe we can find a weakness in them, some way to fight back more effectively. Jon placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. Keep looking. Anything you find might help. Meanwhile, I'll prepare the men. If Mance's horde comes tomorrow, we'll be ready. And if the others come, we'll face them together. Sam nodded, his round face grim with determination. I won't let you down. Jon gave Sam a reassuring squeeze. You never have. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the northern sky had turned an ominous purple, shot through with streaks of orange. Jon walked the ramparts, scanning the vast darkness beyond. Fires glowed in small pockets around Castle Black. Watchfires, cooking flames, the flicker of torches as men patrolled. He felt an odd sense of calm amid the tension, as though all his life had led to this moment. A showdown with the unknown, with the savage elements that threatened civilization itself. He remembered his father's words, how Ned Stark had once told him that when the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies but the pack survives. The words had never felt more apart. Jon was no trueborn Stark, but perhaps it did not matter. He was part of a greater family, those who called the North home, those who defended the realm from the worst of fates. And Robb Stark, despite his war, had not forgotten him. That knowledge filled Jon with a fierce pride and a quiet humility. The world might scorn bastards, but the bond between brothers could transcend such distinctions. Early next morning, Jon organized the new joint forces, instructing them on defensive positions along the wall, the use of oil for burning whites, and the protocol if wildlings approached. Horn blasts would signal different types of threats, 1 for returning brothers, 2 for wildlings, 3 for others. At the mention of 3 blasts, men's faces went pale, but they nodded in grim acknowledgement. Meanwhile, watchers were sent to the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch by the Sea with urgent messages to prepare for coordinated defense. In the afternoon, as if in answer to their preparations, a horn sounded twice, wildlings sighted. Jon raced to the top of the wall, heart hammering. Through the far eye, he saw not just a band but an entire column of hundreds, perhaps 1,000 free folk, approaching with slow determination. He caught glimpses of mammoths and the towering shapes of giants. His blood ran cold. This was more than a stray party. It looked like an advance force. He stepped away from the edge, calling orders. The Black Cloaks and northern men scrambled to man positions. Archers took up vantage points, a line of men readied along the gate with spears, while others prepared pots of oil to pour down if the wildlings tried to climb or break through. Shouts rang out in the yard, but they were organized, not panicked. They had drilled for this. They had prepared. As the wildlings neared, Jon saw that they bore rough-hewn shields and wore mismatched armor, leather, hides, bits of stolen steel. At their head, riding a great shaggy horse, was a man wearing a black cloak trimmed with feathers. Mance Rayder himself, if rumor held true. Jon's heart pounded. This was it. The king beyond the wall had come to parley or to fight. From atop the wall, Jon's voice rang out, carried by the wind. Halt! This is Castle Black, home of the Night's Watch. State your purpose or be fired upon. For a moment, the wildling column wavered. Then the cloaked figure raised a hand and the mass of free folk halted. A single rider broke away, carrying a white cloth. Jon swallowed, exchanging glances with Thorin Mormont beside him. Open the gate enough for 1 rider, Jon ordered. Have archers ready and do not let your guard down. He descended to the courtyard, where the gates parted just enough to let 1 horse and rider through. The rider entered slowly, exuding a wary calm. He halted a few yards inside the castle walls. The men of the watch and their new allies closed ranks in a semicircle. Jon stepped forward. The rider doffed his hood, revealing Mance Rayder, a lean, middle-aged man with graying hair and keen eyes. His gaze swept over the masked defenders, lingering on the banners of northern houses that fluttered among the black cloaks. His mouth curved in a small, knowing smile. So it's true what they say. You have friends among the Northmen. Jon stood straight. I do. The realm stands behind the Night's Watch. Why have you come here with an army, Mance? Mance dismounted, hands held away from his weapons in a gesture of minimal aggression. I come to talk terms, Jon Snow. We want passage through the wall. The threat behind us is far greater than any threat we pose to you. Let us through, and we'll not raise a hand against your realm. Jon's men stirred uneasily, but he kept his voice steady. Your words are easy to say, but how do we know you'll keep them? Mance gave a rueful chuckle. You don't, but I have tens of thousands more behind me. And trust me, Jon Snow, we're not here to conquer. We're here to survive. The others come behind us, unstoppable, unrelenting. Your wall won't keep them out forever. We offer to stand with you if you let us pass. Jon's gaze flicked to the looming shapes on the horizon. So that was Mance's gambit, to emphasize their shared enemy. He glanced around, seeing the uncertainty in the eyes of the men behind him. He could almost hear the question on their tongues. Could they ally with wildlings, those they had fought for generations, in order to face something worse? He asked quietly, and if we refuse? Mance's expression darkened. Then we'll do what we must. We'll break through, and you'll lose men. More men than you can afford. Believe me, Lord Commander, I'm not eager to fight, but my people will not die in the cold, at the hands of whites or others. We'll take our chances here. Jon let out a slow breath. He was acutely aware of the stares around him. Ser Alliser Thorne's face was pinched, ready to rail against trusting wildlings. Thorin Mormont looked torn, remembering the horrors they had just witnessed in the western camp. The northern men shifted warily, swords half-drawn. Jon cleared his throat, voice carrying in the cold air. If you want peace, lay down your arms. Surrender your weapons. Come through in small groups so we can ensure none of you pose a threat. Mance shook his head. I can't ask my people to disarm entirely. You wouldn't do it either. But I can offer you a gesture. We'll leave the mammoths and giants behind the ridge for now. Approach in smaller bands. We'll form a new camp near the wall, under your watch, and we won't advance beyond without your consent. But we keep our blades. We have enemies amongst ourselves, splinter groups. It's too dangerous. Jon set his jaw. He sensed that, from the Watch's perspective, it was already too great a concession. But he also recalled the scorched devastation in that wildling camp to the west. The others, if Mance was telling the truth, then soon enough they might face an enemy that could tear through them all. Perhaps it was time for a compromise never before seen in the history of the Wall. He raised his voice for all to hear. I will speak with my officers and the northern lords. If we find your terms acceptable, we'll arrange a controlled crossing under strict supervision. Any sign of treachery and we'll meet you with fire and steel. Agreed. Mance's eyes flicked to the archers lining the walls. He inclined his head. Agreed. But you must decide quickly. My people can't wait in the cold much longer. Jon nodded tersely. Mance swung back onto his horse, trotting out through the gate which clanked shut behind him. The castle yard erupted into a cacophony of voices, men turning to one another, half in shock, half in rage. Some shouted that they should kill all wildlings, others insisted that forging an alliance was the only way. Amid it all, Jon stood like a pillar, silently meeting the furious gazes and fearful murmurs. We'll meet in the hall, he announced, trying to inject his voice with calm authority. We decide together. But let's keep in mind, if we do nothing, Mance's horde will either attack or freeze, and the others will grow stronger with every corpse. We can't face this threat alone. A hush followed, broken only by the shuffle of boots on stone. Men began filtering into the common hall or climbing to vantage points on the wall, weapons still in hand. This was a moment that could shape the North for generations, a moment that might earn the respect of all the southern kingdoms if they managed to unify against a shared nightmare. And it fell to Jon Snow, the once-forgotten bastard, to navigate these treacherous waters. High overhead, the sky remained a flat, wintry gray as though the gods themselves watched in guarded anticipation. The horn had blown, the armies had arrived, and the world teetered on the cusp of upheaval. Jon took a steadying breath and walked toward the hall, ready to plead his case. He did not know if he would succeed, but he understood one thing. Winter had come, bringing with it terrors beyond mortal ken. And if the realm of men was to survive, this might be the only chance to stand as one, brothers in black, kings in the north, and even the free folk. Duty weighed on Jon's shoulders like the wall itself, but he set his jaw and pressed on, resolved to do what he must. Inside the common hall of Castle Black, men pressed shoulder to shoulder in tense clusters. The air felt charged, as if lightning flickered in the rafters, yet the only light came from rows of torches and a great iron brazier in the center of the chamber. Smoke wafted upward, stinging the eyes of those gathered, black brothers of the Night's Watch, stewards and rangers, as well as the northern lords and their retinues who had come in Robb Stark's name. Over the past few moons, these men had shared the yard, shared their meals, and drilled side by side. Now, they shared a moment that could alter their future forever. Jon Snow stood at one end of the brazier, gloved hands clasped behind his back, dark hair brushing the collar of his heavy black cloak. His gaze swept across the upturned faces. As Lord Commander, he was now duty-bound to hear every voice before making a choice that could either save them all or plunge them into ruin. Hours earlier, Mance Rayder had entered Castle Black as a solitary envoy, offering negotiations rather than immediate bloodshed. Jon had told Mance he needed time to consult with his officers and allies. Now here they were, the weight of that decision looming heavier than the wall itself. Ser Alliser Thorne stood off to Jon's right, his mouth drawn in a tight line. Thorne's gaunt cheeks and sunken eyes betrayed his discomfort with the idea of any alliance with wildlings, though he remained publicly stoic. The Bear Island men, led by Thorin Mormont, clustered nearby, arms folded and expressions set in grim lines. Lord Serwyn's cousin, a tall, reedy man named Rodwell, exchanged worried looks with a pair of Manderly knights who still wore tokens of the White Merman upon their cloaks. In the corners, a handful of newer recruits, black cloaks barely broken in, listened with rapt attention, the tension on their young faces shining plain as day. Jon cleared his throat, stepping forward so that the circle of torchlight pooled around him. "Brothers," he began, voice carrying over the low murmur. "And loyal men of the North, I won't waste words. You know what's at stake. Mance Rayder leads the free folk, wildlings, if you prefer, by the tens of thousands. They're gathering, and many stand but a day's march from our gates. They have giants and mammoths, and I do not doubt they can do great harm if they attack in force. Yet Mance comes to us under a white flag. He says he will stand beside us against the others if we allow his people through." The hall erupted in a clamor, objections, curses, a few voices raised in hesitant support. Jon lifted a hand, calling for silence. "I've scouted the wildling camps," Jon said. "So have our rangers. We've seen with our own eyes what stalks the far north. The others move in the shadows, raising the dead to do their bidding. We found a camp of free folk wiped out, corpses arranged in grisly patterns. If the wildlings don't cross the wall, if they remain trapped out there, they will die, and every one of them could become another white in the service of the others." Some men blanched at that image. A few spat as if to ward off evil. Jon pressed on. Mance knows he cannot truly conquer the North. His people are desperate to flee a worse fate. But he will fight if cornered. A battle will cost us dearly in lives we cannot afford. Even if we prevailed, we'd be too weak to face the real threat afterward. Ser Alliser Thorne took a step forward, voice tight with contained anger. "You say we cannot afford a battle, Lord Commander. But can we afford to let these savages pass into the realm? They've raided our villages for generations, stolen livestock, slaughtered farmers. Are we to forget that now?" A murmur of agreement rippled through several men. Thorin Mormont nodded grimly. "I lost 2 uncles in wildling raids. They slew them in their own hall back on Bear Island, took their weapons, and vanished in the night. That is a debt of blood." Jon kept his voice measured. "I do not suggest we forget or forgive every past atrocity. But I beg you to consider the future. If the others come, as we know they must, these grudges will mean little. The free folk, too, have bled and lost to this nightmare. You all saw the rangers who returned shaken by what they witnessed in that deserted camp. If we turn the wildlings away, they will fight us for the right to live. Blood will be spilled on both sides. And behind them come the dead, who will kill indiscriminately or, worse, raise our fallen against us. Then the entire North will stand alone, surrounded by an army of undead." A hush settled. Men looked to one another, uncertain. Jon took advantage of the momentary calm. "Mance Rayder claims he'll come through in small groups under our supervision. They'll set up a camp under the wall, on the side, not venturing further south without our leave. I'll hold him to that. If any band tries to cross on their own, we stop them. Our archers are well prepared, our towers manned. But if we grant them safe passage under heavy watch with terms set, then we gain thousands of potential allies." "Allies?" someone scoffed. A tall ranger with a thick mustache stepped forward, face twisted in skepticism. "And who among them can we trust? Will they truly fight beside us when the others march, or just melt into the countryside to raid another day?" Jon's dark eyes met the rangers. "We can't force them all to be loyal. But Mance has kept his people together this long, he has real influence. If he forswears aggression, many of them will listen. Some may not, and we'll deal with that. The difference is, we won't be fighting an entire horde bent on storming our gates." A man from House Manderly lifted a gloved hand. "But how do we ensure they hold to their word? Even if Mance does, there could be splinter groups or raiders we can't contain. It's a risk." Jon nodded gravely. "It is. But any plan we choose will be risky. Fighting them outright is just as risky, perhaps more so. If we allow them to move under our supervision, we keep them in one place, keep them fed, and watch for trouble. We have fortifications, watchtowers, trained archers, and more men than the Watch has had in years, thanks to the North. Ser Alisos' lip curled. We'd be using resources to feed the same free folk who've killed our brothers for generations. Suppose they starve once winter hits in full? Will they keep quiet then, or riot and attempt to seize what they need? Jon clenched his jaw. That's a concern. But we have commitments from Robb Stark. The North is rallying. If we coordinate with local lords for enough provisions, we can ration. Mance claims they bring their own supplies. Dried meats, foraged grains. And we mustn't forget, without their old life in the true North, many free folk will be forced to adapt to our ways or perish. We can't offer them plenty, but we can offer survival, and that might just keep them in line. Someone from the back shouted, "What about the giants? The mammoths? Let them in too? We can't have beasts wandering around the gift." Laughter, harsh and uncertain, followed. Jon lifted a hand for quiet. The giants are not mere beasts. They are sapient. If we handle them with respect, they could be formidable allies against the dead. Mance says he'll keep them at a distance for now, perhaps near the mountains west of the Shadow Tower, until we see reason to bring them closer. An uneasy silence followed, punctuated by the hiss and pop of torches. The crowd turned to see Maester Aemon, ancient, fragile, but still wise, slowly making his way forward. Though his eyes had long since turned cloudy, his voice carried a gentle authority. One of the stewards supported him under the arm as he spoke. "Brothers of the Watch," the old man began. "I have lived many years, more than most in this hall will ever see. I have known princes, kings, and commoners alike. I remember stories of the long night when the others came before. In those days, all the peoples of Westeros stood together, lords, small folk, warriors, and yes, even the free folk beyond the wall. Without that unity, the darkness might never have lifted. If these are truly the same horrors returned, then let us not be fools. Division will destroy us." He paused to catch his breath. The Night's Watch was created for one purpose, to guard the realms of men. That includes those who live outside the realm's borders if they will stand with us. The time for old hatreds may pass, lest we all perish in the cold. I support Lord Commander Snow in this course. Sometimes, my friends, we must do what is most difficult to achieve what is necessary. His words hung heavy in the flickering torchlight. Most men did not peak, but their bearing shifted as though a door had opened in their minds. Jon felt an upswell of gratitude toward the old maester. He glanced at Ser Alisos, whose face had grown stony. Thorne might never truly relent, but even he knew better than to publicly oppose Maester Aemon's counsel without care. At last, Jon addressed the crowd again, voice low but firm. "If we stand alone, we will fail. The free folk stand at our door, so let us find a way to use that to our advantage rather than fall to their axes or to the swords of whites. I propose we send terms to Mance. He and his closest advisors can cross first unarmed. We speak face to face, draw up the details of an accord. Then we organize how his people will pass under our watch. Their weapons stay in their wagons or on their belts, but they use them only under threat of others or not at all." Thorin Mormont folded his massive arms. "I'll never trust a wildling, but I trust the man I see before me who's proven himself as Lord Commander. If you say this is the best chance for us all, then I'll lend Bear Island's men to keep the peace. But if Mance or his people break faith, we will slaughter them where they stand." Murmurs of agreement followed from other northern lords. They would not embrace the wildlings, but they would obey Jon's leadership if he vowed vigilance. Jon gave a solemn nod. "Agreed. If they break faith, we defend ourselves without mercy. But let us hope it doesn't come to that." He surveyed the hall, allowing silence to settle like dust. "Then it's decided. I'll send word to Mance in the morning. For now, keep the watch. Keep your men ready. And pray the others wait long enough for us to see this alliance through." Slowly, the assembly dissolved. Men filed out, some with hard eyes of reluctance, others looking thoughtful, a few appearing almost hopeful that perhaps this bold gamble could save them all. Jon watched them go, exhaustion gripping him, but also a sense of purpose. He knew the path ahead would be fraught. Coordinating this arrangement with Mance's enormous following would be like juggling torches over a pit of wildfire. But at least they had chosen a path no small feat at a time when all of Westeros seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. He left the hall, stepping into the courtyard where the wind cut sharp as a blade. The sky stretched wide and black above, stars muted by faint cloud cover. Torches flickered along the ramparts, silhouettes of watchers pacing back and forth. In the distance, John imagined he saw the fires of the wildling camp, though perhaps it was only his mind conjuring images. He felt the chill of night air in his bones, but he squared his shoulders. The die was cast. Sam found him there, breath puffing in the cold as he hurried across the yard. "John," Sam began, voice tinged with excitement and worry. "I heard what happened in the hall. You're really going to let the wildlings through?" John nodded, a weight pressing on his chest. "If Mance agrees to our terms." Sam's round face broke into a conflicted smile. "I was just going over some old records, fragments of the Long Night. There are references to alliances between the Night's Watch and the Free Folk, though the details are scarce. It's not entirely without precedent, you know?" John rested a hand on Sam's shoulder. "I appreciate that, Sam. We'll need all the historical knowledge we can get. Write to the libraries in Winterfell, White Harbor, anywhere you can. Maybe we'll find mention of how our ancestors survived." Sam swallowed. "Yes, of course. I'm trying to compile everything I can. But it's a great deal of work, and time is short." John almost smiled. "We do what we can. For tonight, try to sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins." Sam nodded, then returned inside to continue his reading, leaving John alone under the great black sky. He ran a hand through his hair, a swirl of emotions coursing through him. A memory of Ghost flashed in his mind. His direwolf companion, currently out beyond the walls on a scouting run of his own. John often let Ghost roam north of the wall, returning now and again like a silent shadow. The thought gave him a small comfort. At least he was not the only watchful set of eyes out there. With a final slow breath, John retired to his solar to draft the message that would shape tomorrow's dawn. When morning came, it dawned pale and cold, a sky of pewter clouds. John oversaw the dispatch of a single rider to approach Mance's lines under a white banner. The message was clear. Mance, or a small retinue chosen by him, could enter Castle Black unarmed to discuss how the crossing would proceed. If Mance refused, John warned that the gate would remain shut and any assault would be met with unyielding force. Hours passed with no response. John busied himself on the training grounds, checking in with new recruits, conferring with the Northern Lords, and recalculating supplies. They had set aside an area near the old stables as a potential campsite for a limited number of wildlings. But the question remained how they would accommodate thousands more. Perhaps, John mused, they could be funneled south in small groups to settle temporarily in the Gift's scattered ruins. It would be complicated, but not impossible, especially if the local lords cooperated or at least tolerated the free folks' presence. The alternative was pitched battle or wholesale slaughter. Near midday, the horn sounded once. A returning rider. John ascended the main gate steps to meet him. The man, a lanky steward named Dover, bowed stiffly in the saddle. His horse snorted clouds of steam in the cold air. "Lord Commander," Dover said, voice somewhat breathless. "Mance has agreed to parley. He and 3 of his people will come at first light tomorrow. He wants your word that they'll be safe." John felt a knot of tension begin to ease. They will be safe as long as they follow our terms. He surveyed the watchers around him, men with hands resting on sword hilts. "We have a busy night ahead. Spread the word, Mance arrives at dawn." Dover dipped his head and rode off into the courtyard. John gazed out beyond the open gate a moment longer, imagining what the next day might bring. Negotiations with the king beyond the wall. All the old stories, all the training he'd received since youth had never prepared him for this. Yet here he was. He exhaled a long breath before stepping down from the gatehouse to make his final preparations. That evening, Castle Black buzzed with nervous energy. Fires burned brightly in every brazier, forging a cocoon of heat against the encroaching cold. Men cleaned their blades and whispered guesses about how the parley might go. The northern lords formed their own cluster, voices hushed in some unseen corner of the yard. John could sense their reluctance, but also a hint of respect. At least they were following his lead. Thorin Mormont caught John's eye from afar, giving a terse nod as if to say, "We'll try it your way, but be careful." John wrote more letters by candlelight in his solar, dispatching ravens to Winterfell and to certain lords of the north, informing them that a critical negotiation was underway. He kept the details brief, hinting only that an arrangement might be formed to slow or halt a wildling invasion. He ended each letter with a reminder that the true threat lay beyond. Perhaps the Starks and their bannermen could make ready if things took a dire turn. He also sent one raven southward, albeit with less optimism, to King's Landing. The letter explained that the Night's Watch was engaged in vital defense operations. The Crown rarely heeded the Watch's pleas, but courtesy demanded he keep them informed. After all, if thousands of free folk suddenly poured across the northern frontier, word would spread. Best they hear from Jon first. Sleep did not come easily, but come it did. Jon woke in the pre-dawn darkness, dressing in layers of black wool and leather. He buckled Longclaw at his hip, taking comfort in its familiar weight. Outside, the wind was calm, but the air stung like knives. The eastern sky glowed with the faintest suggestion of gray as men gathered at the gate, torches and lanterns in hand. Jon stood at the forefront, flanked by Ser Alliser Thorne and Thorin Mormont. Behind them waited a half-circle of Black brothers and northern men, armed but under orders to keep their distance. High above, archers peered over the parapets, bows at the ready but pointed skyward for now. The first light of dawn revealed shapes on the horizon. For figures approached on horseback, the crunch of snow audible as they drew nearer. Mance Rayder rode in the lead, his cloak a patchwork of furs and crow feathers. Beside him rode a tall, broad-shouldered man with a burning red beard, Tormund Giantsbane, if the rumors were correct. The other two riders were women. One with the rangy grace of a hunter, carrying a longbow on her back, likely Val or Dalla, kin to Mance's companion, though it was hard to be certain from this distance. The second woman's hair was dark, her cheeks wind-burned, her eyes scanning the gate as if measuring her odds of survival. When they drew close enough that voices could carry, Jon stepped forward. "Welcome to Castle Black," he called. "I have given my word no harm will come to you so long as your own blades remain sheathed." Mance lifted a hand in greeting. "Well met, Jon Snow. We come unarmed but for our knives as we agreed. I trust your men will not murder us all the same." Jon looked over at his men. The tension crackled, but no one moved to draw a sword. "Your safety is assured," Jon said. "Dismount and follow me inside. We can speak by the brazier." Mance swung down from his horse, Tormund and the two women doing likewise. Each appeared to carry only a small knife at the belt, though Tormund's was sizable enough to make some watchers uneasy. Jon led them into the courtyard, through a lane of black cloaks who watched warily. They could have convened in the Lord Commander's solar, but that would have felt too cramped, too fraught with the possibility of an ambush. Instead, Jon brought them to the open yard near the fire pit that burned throughout the day, though the morning's light now offered a silver hue over the snow. A ring of watchers and northern warriors formed at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to allow conversation. Jon faced Mance Rayder squarely. "You know our terms. You and your people cross under our supervision in small groups. You set up a camp to the east, by Queensgate, or to the west near Oakenshield if you prefer. We can help supply you with what little we can spare, and you provide us your warriors if the others attack." Mance's eyes flicked around, lingering on the men in northern garb. "What of them? Will they stand in agreement with you?" A tall man with a Serwyn sigil on his cloak stepped forward. "We stand behind the Lord Commander, Wildling. The king in the north entrusted him to guard these lands. Our swords are his to command." Mance raised an eyebrow. "So, it seems the boy who was once a steward has quite the backing now." His gaze shifted to Jon. "But your terms as stated are not enough. My people won't come in small groups like cattle to the slaughter, single file under your walls." Tormund Giantsbane snorted. "We're free folk. We don't queue up at your gates like kneeling dogs." His voice boomed, echoing against the stone. Jon fought to keep his voice calm. "Then come in manageable bands, no more than a few hundred at a time. That's to ensure no panic or sudden clashes. You have thousands, Mance. We have only so many places to house you, only so many men to watch them. Let's avoid a stampede." The red-haired woman with the bow on her back spoke up, her tone edged with frustration. "You want to break our host apart. Weaken us. You think we don't see that, Crow?" "Val," Mance said quietly, giving her a small warning glance. Then he turned back to Jon. "If the bulk of us remain beyond the wall, we're vulnerable to the others. We've seen what they can do. People vanish in the night, or rise up with blue eyes to slaughter their kin. The free folk won't calmly stand in line waiting for that fate." Jon took a measured breath. "We'll open more than one crossing if necessary. Castle Black here, the Shadow Tower to the west, Eastwatch on the coast. We can funnel your people in from multiple points to speed the process. Tormund can lead a portion to the Shadow Tower, and you can lead another here if that helps. The key is that we maintain order and check that no whites slip through." At the mention of whites, Tension flickered in Mance's expression. He rubbed his gloved hands together. Very well. Multiple crossings might serve. But I want your vow that we will not be attacked as we pass. No Lord of the South rides up to butcher us mid-journey. And no black-cloaked archers rain arrows on us from above. Jon nodded firmly. You have that vow. Our watchers have orders not to fire unless you break faith, unless you attack or appear to be raising arms against us. I cannot promise what southern lords might do far from the wall, but the king in the north has pledged to support our cause. He will not sanction any wanton slaughter of your people. A beat. As for other southern factions, that is more uncertain. We have no treaties with King's Landing or the Lannisters. Mance folded his arms. We'll deal with that if it comes to it. Right now, we want to live another day. You let us through, we hold no ill will. But if any band of your realm comes at us, I'll not restrain my people from defending themselves. Jon met Mance's stare. That's fair. But your people must understand. They can't simply raid and pillage once they're south of the wall. I know old habits die hard, but if they do that, the lords will respond with force. Then everything we're trying to do here will be undone. Mance glanced at Tormund and Val. The second woman with dark hair, Dalla perhaps, spoke quietly. We can spread the word among the clans, try to keep the peace. But some have old feuds, old grudges. We're not a single united kingdom, you know. The corners of Jon's mouth tightened. Nor is Westeros. But at least for now, let us keep the peace between us. The others are the real threat. Tormund scowled, scratching his beard. Damn right they are. I've seen him, Jon Snow. Your pretty castles and your fancy knights won't matter once the whites come tearing through your gates. Then let us combine our strength, Jon said. The Watch, the Free Folk, and the North, at least. Better we stand together than fall alone. Mance studied Jon's face, as if searching for a lie. After a tense moment, he nodded slowly. Agreed. We've come this far, might as well see it through. I'll send riders to the Shadow Tower with Tormund, another group to Eastwatch, and we'll begin crossing in daily intervals. You'll have watchers posted, yes? Jon inclined his head. Yes. We'll examine your people for signs of white or sickness before granting entry. We'll keep records of who crosses. If that's acceptable. Mance shot him a dry smile. Paperwork from a crow. I suppose that's the price of staying alive. Ser Alliser Thorne cleared his throat abruptly, stepping forward. We are not at your mercy, wildling. Remember that. One sign of treachery and we end this arrangement. You won't even have time to beg. Tormund bristled, but Mance held up a hand. We understand. We need this alliance as much as you do. Jon nodded, ignoring Thorne's glare. Then we should formalize it. You four will remain as guests for now under watch to coordinate the crossing. Each day we'll send word to your people on how many can come. We begin at dawn tomorrow. Mance shared a look with Tormund, Val, and Dalla. At last he turned back to Jon. That soon, eh? Fine. But if we see the others or hear word they're moving closer, we'll speed up. Then your fancy gate might get crowded. We'll handle it, Jon said. And so the terms were struck. Tormund Giantsbane, never one for political niceties, spat on the ground and offered a meaty hand to Jon as though sealing a blood pact. Jon clasped forearms with him, feeling the brute strength in Tormund's grip. Mance watched the exchange with the quiet gravity of a leader who had played a long and dangerous game. Val and Dalla exchanged uncertain glances, but relief subtly touched their eyes, as if they had half expected the Watch to simply slaughter them on sight. A hush lay upon the watchers around the yard, many of whom stood slack-jawed at the notion of forging peace with their ancestral enemies. But no one moved to stop the negotiations or protest further. The lines had been drawn. Now it was a matter of seeing them through. In the hours that followed, Jon arranged for Mance, Tormund, Val, and Dalla to be quartered in a disused tower room near the eastern wall of the castle. Guards were posted at all times, rotating every few hours. Neither side was willing to trust entirely. Mance and Tormund found the arrangement stifling, but they complied. Val and Dalla conferred with each other in hushed voices, evidently planning how to spread the word among the scattered wildling clans. Messengers under Watch escort would ride north to coordinate the movement toward Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower. Meanwhile, Jon had his own flurry of preparations. He tasked Ser Alliser Thorne with organizing the archers, ensuring they were fully briefed on the new protocols. One arrow shot in panic could spark a massacre. Thorne accepted the duty with a begrudging nod, though the set of his jaw told Jon he remained deeply opposed to this alliance in principle. Jon reminded Thorne of the vow they had all taken to guard the realms of men. Wildlings, for better or worse, were men too. That ended their conversation on a stalemate of sorts. Thorin Mormont and the Northern Lords took on the role of coordinating supply lines and patrols around the gift. They reluctantly agreed to dispatch riders to local villages, instructing them to prepare for a large influx of free folk and to maintain caution. The message was not a request so much as a directive from the king in the north supporters, but Jon worried how the local peasants might react when confronted with wildlings at their doorstep. To forestall violence, small squads of Black Brothers and Northern Knights would patrol the roads, hopefully preventing skirmishes. By nightfall, the entire castle felt tense as a drawn bowstring. Word spread quickly, the wildlings would start crossing at dawn. Even from the top of the wall, one could make out the glimmer of far-off fires where free folk were camped, awaiting their turn. Jon found it difficult to sleep, his mind a tumult of scenarios, best case, worst case, and everything in between. Finally, he dozed off in his solar, cheek pressed against a spread of maps and rosters. The horns sounded at first light. Jon roused himself, splashed water on his face, and donned his gear. Outside, the courtyard lay dusted with fresh snow. Pale golden rays of morning light cast long shadows across the ramparts. Men moved with purpose, taking up positions on the wall walk, at the gate, and along the courtyard perimeter. Jon ascended to a vantage point above the main gate so he could oversee what might be the first peaceful crossing of wildlings in living memory. Mance Rayder arrived at the gate with Tormund, escorted by 2 Black Brothers. From the parapet, Jon could see them conversing quietly, Tormund occasionally pointing at the silhouettes of wildlings emerging from the distant tree line. Over 100 of them approached, trudging through the snow in a loose formation. They were mostly families, women and children, along with a handful of men who carried crates or pushed crude sleds piled with furs and supplies. These were not the frontline warriors of Mance's host, but more likely one of the smaller clans looking to avoid conflict. At the sight of them, some of Jon's watchers muttered curses or spat. Others exchanged uneasy glances, never having seen so many wildlings approach so openly. As planned, a detail of watchers stepped outside the gate, meeting the wildlings in the open ground before the wall. They inspected for injuries and signs of white infection, frostbitten flesh, suspicious wounds, the glassy eyes of the undead. The children clung to their mothers, some wide-eyed at the sight of black armor and the towering ice structure behind them. Jon overheard a few sniffles that might have been tears. For all the talk of savage wildlings, many were plainly just frightened families seeking refuge from a nightmare. "Open the gate," Jon called down when the inspection concluded. The iron portcullis groaned, rising to admit the group. They filed in slowly, eyes full of caution, dwarfed by the looming walls of Castle Black. Brothers stood at intervals to guide them toward an area roped off in the courtyard. Tormund watched from the side, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to harm these families. None did. The crossing continued over the next hours. More groups arrived, a scraggly band of hunters in tattered furs, a group leading a pair of rangy goats, and even a handful of older men who limped along on crude crutches. Each was searched, questioned briefly, then allowed through. In the distance, Jon could see a larger crowd gathering, perhaps several hundred more, waiting for their turn. This was exactly why he had insisted on small increments. To let them all rush in at once would be chaos. Throughout it all, Mance Rayder stood to one side, watching with an inscrutable expression. Now and then he exchanged words with Tormund or Val, verifying that everything proceeded as they'd arranged. Val personally escorted a few women through, speaking reassuringly to them in a mixture of the common tongue and the old free folk dialect. Dalla remained in the tower room unwell after weeks of harsh travel, but Mance had said she could advise him from within. By midday, Castle Black's courtyard had swelled with new arrivals and tension hovered in the air. The Black Brothers watched them with guarded stares, hands never straying far from sword hilts. Some of the wildlings glared back defiantly. Others huddled in corners, uncertain what to expect from these kneelers. The possibility of a spark, one angry shove, one misunderstanding felt palpable. Jon directed Ser Alliser to keep archers posted in the yard, but with arrows unnocked. A show of force, but not aggression. "We have tents ready to the east," Jon announced to Mance. "We'll guide your people there before sundown. You can join them or remain here for further coordination." Mance nodded, rubbing a hand over his chin. "I'll bring Tormund back and forth. I'll have Val speak with some of the women who are too fearful. We must reassure them that they won't be slaughtered in their beds tonight." Jon exhaled, ignoring the knot in his stomach. We're doing all we can to see that no blood is spilled. He glanced around the courtyard. The mingling of black cloaks and free folk was so bizarre to witness. For 1,000 years, they had been enemies. Now necessity forced them side by side. As the sun began its descent, a fresh layer of snow drifted from the sky. A handful of watchers led the newly arrived wildlings out through the side gate, guiding them toward an old settlement in the eastern edge of the gift. Some dragged sleds of supplies, others carried children on their backs. Mance, Tormund, and Val conferred with them in quiet tones. It was a strange exodus, watched by men on the walls as though they still couldn't believe it. The crossing on that first day ended without violence. Jon silently thanked the gods. One day down. Many more to go. Over the next week, the process repeated. Wildling clans trickled in, sometimes tens, sometimes hundreds. They were inspected, questioned briefly, then passed through. A few minor scuffles broke out. Some wildlings refused to hand over prized weapons for inspection, or a black brother said something disparaging that led to a scuffle. But no major bloodshed occurred, thanks in part to Tormund's loud threats and Mance's watchful eye. Slowly, the free folk spread out in the area just south of the wall, setting up makeshift camps. A portion traveled onto the Shadow Tower, and word reached Jon that Eastwatch had begun receiving arrivals as well. The Watchers' nightly patrols doubled. Jon insisted on constant vigilance. If the others were out there, he expected them to strike sooner rather than later, now that so many living souls gathered in one area. The tension between Black Brothers and wildlings remained high. Decades of hatred did not simply vanish. But necessity enforced a brutal truce. Each dawn found more sleds arriving, more fur-clad families trudging through, until the entire base of the wall began to resemble a small city of tents and fires. Messengers from the north arrived, bearing supplies promised by Robb Stark's network of loyal lords. Barrels of salted fish, crates of turnips and onions, sacks of oats. It was not enough to feed everyone lavishly, but it forestalled starvation. Mance's people contributed what they could in smoked meats and dried berries. Small squads of watchers or northern knights escorted hunts in the nearby forests, returning with game to distribute. Winter was not yet at its darkest, so there remained a thin sliver of hope for obtaining enough food. Jon felt the unspoken question from both sides: how long can this uneasy arrangement last before something cracks? He continued to receive word from Robb Stark in the form of ravens that arrived every few days. The king in the north was embroiled in his own war, but he sent promises of more men when possible, as well as instructions to keep the wildlings contained. The letters carried a tone of cautious endorsement. Robb trusted Jon's judgment yet understood the enormous risk. One letter concluded with, "If the realm does not see the wisdom of your actions now, it soon will. Continue to hold the watch, for winter marches on all of us." Maester Aemon's health began to falter further. The old man struggled with the bitter cold and his appetite waned. Yet his mind remained sharp. Often, Jon found him in his chambers, hunched over old scrolls that Sam read aloud, searching for references to the others. One evening, Aemon beckoned Jon close, his voice thin as spider silk. "Jon," he said, "the records we have suggest that fire is key to stopping the others, or dragoglass, what the old texts call obsidian. Have you any access to such materials?" Jon thought of Dragonstone, where Stannis Baratheon once held power. "We have a small stash of dragon glass daggers that Sam and I found. It's not enough to equip an entire army." Aemon's milky eyes flicked in Sam's direction, who hovered anxiously with a thick tome in his arms. "Then see if the king in the north can acquire more. If the threat proves real, every shard might help. And wildfire, perhaps, but that is a dangerous substance." Jon nodded, his brow furrowed. "I'll send another raven to Robb. Maybe his connections to the Vale or the Stormlands can help. Though with the war raging, it might be difficult." Aemon's voice trembled. "Do what you must, my lord. Time is never on our side." The next morning, fresh trouble arrived. A black brother came galloping into Castle Black, spattered with mud and snow, face pale as death. He gasped out a tale of a wildling band attacking a northern farming village an hour's ride from the wall, looting stores of grain and injuring several villagers. Supposedly, these wildlings claimed they needed food for their starving children. The local peasants tried to resist, leading to violence. One villager was left dead in the snow. Jon felt a sick lurch in his gut. After so many days of careful crossing, it all threatened to unravel in an instant. "Where are these wildlings now?" he demanded. The rider swallowed hard. "Fled deeper into the gift, heading east," they said. The villagers demanded retribution. "They want these raiders punished or driven off." Jon pressed his lips together. Could it be that not all wildlings abided by Mance's agreement? That was unsurprising, if maddening. "Gather a party of watchers. I'll see Mance about it." If we let this pass, the villagers might take matters into their own hands, and then we'll have open warfare. He found Mance in the courtyard, speaking with Tormund over a makeshift table where they had spread out a rough map of the region. Jon wasted no time. A band of your people raided a village south of here, leaving at least one dead. We can't allow that. Mance's face hardened. I told them all, no raids. Survival, yes, but not murder. Some won't listen, I know. Which clan? We're not certain, Jon said. Witnesses described them as wearing wolf pelts, with bone decorations in their hair. Tormund cursed under his breath. Likely the Weeping Wolves clan. They're known for being stubborn. They might not recognize your authority, Mance. Mance's jaw flexed. They do, but they choose to ignore it. This is exactly what I feared might happen. I'll send a few of my best trackers. See if we can catch them before they do more harm. Jon's voice was firm. I'll come with you. This is part of our agreement. The villagers want blood. We have to show them that we won't tolerate lawlessness from either side. Mance looked at Tormund, who gave a gruff nod. All right, the king beyond the wall said. We'll do it together. They assembled a mixed party. 12 black brothers, 5 northern warriors, Tormund, Val, and a few wildling scouts who knew the Weeping Wolves. The tension in the group was palpable. Few black brothers relished riding beside wildlings. But orders were orders. Jon reiterated that any sign of the Weeping Wolves was to be approached carefully, giving them a chance to surrender. They set out at a brisk pace, following the road that led into the gift. The midday sun offered a hint of warmth, reflecting off the snowy fields. Wind stirred the trees along the roadside. Now and then, the party passed small farmsteads or deserted huts. The occupants either holed up inside or fled at the sight of such a strange coalition. Jon kept Ghost at his side, the dire wolf loping silently, crimson eyes scanning for threats. Tormund eyed Ghost warily, though he recognized the beast from earlier encounters. How many of your people roam these lands unchecked? Jon asked Mance quietly as they rode. Mance shrugged. Not many. Most know to come directly to the wall if they want to cross. But some are proud. They think they can take what they need. We free folk aren't used to kneeling snow. You don't have to kneel, Jon replied. But you do have to abide by some rules. Easy to say. We've lived by our own ways for centuries, and now we're told to follow yours or starve. Jon glanced at him. A fair point, but either we learn to coexist or we destroy each other. There's no time for old grudges. Mance said nothing, only pressed his lips into a line as their horses picked up speed. The tracks led them across a frozen stream and through a cluster of woods. After an hour of searching, they found the first sign of the Weeping Wolves, footprints, droppings from a pair of mules, and a discarded bit of cloth. Tormund's wildling scouts crouched over the tracks and conferred quietly. They pointed east. They rode on, the forest thickening around them. The wind sighed through pines, scattering powdery snow. Ghost trotted ahead, ears alert. Jon's grip tightened on Longclaw's hilt, a nagging sense of unease creeping in. If these wildlings were cornered, they might fight savagely. Many of the men in the search party were on edge, especially the black brothers who had lost friends to wildling raids in the past. Suddenly, Ghost halted, nose lifted to the wind. Jon reined in his horse, following the direwolf's line of sight to a spot where the pines stood denser. A figure darted between the trees. Then another. Wildlings wearing wolf pelts, bone ornaments clacking softly. The Weeping Wolves clan. Surround them, Jon murmured. Tormund signaled his scouts to fan out. 2 black brothers readied their bows, but Jon hissed, hold your fire. The party advanced, spreading in a semicircle to trap the fugitives against the stream behind them. The figures ducked behind trunks and rocks. One man, tall and wiry, poked his head out, leveling a spear. His face was painted with white swirls, giving him a ghostly look. Mance urged his horse forward. Korik, he bellowed, voice ringing in the winter air. Stop hiding. Come out and speak. A pause, and then the man with the spear stepped into the open, 6 others appearing behind him. They looked worn and tired, clothes ragged. One woman clutched a child's hand, eyes wild with fear. Korik glared at Mance, then spat near his feet. We do not kneel to crows. You promised freedom, Mance, but you let them herd us like sheep through their gate. Mance's jaw tightened. And I said no raiding. You slew a villager. He fought back. One of the other weeping wolves snarled. We only wanted enough grain to feed ourselves. Is that a crime? Jon spoke up, trying to keep his tone level. Killing the man was. Stealing was. You don't have to kneel, but you do have to respect the laws south of the wall. Corric's eyes flicked from Jon to Mance. So you side with crows now, Mance? You'd see your own people starve? Nobody wants you to starve, Mance said in a low voice. We have supplies near Castle Black. You could have gone there. Instead, you caused bloodshed. The woman behind Corric clutched the child's hand tighter. We heard the crows would take our weapons, separate us, force us to bow like kneelers. No better than the White Walkers waiting to devour us. Those are rumors, Tormund growled. We keep our blades if we behave. These crows have been fair so far. If you doubt me, you can taste my steel. A ripple of tension passed through both parties. Jon's men reached for their sword hilts, the wildlings hefted spears. Sensing the danger, Jon held up a hand. No. We didn't come here to start a war. Corric, you and your people can return with us to the wall peacefully. You'll face questioning for the murder and the raid, but if you cooperate, we can settle this without more bloodshed. Corric's painted face twisted in anger. And what will become of us? Tried before a kneeler court, locked in a cold cell? We've never bowed to any lord or king. We only wanted to eat. Mance and Tormund exchanged glances. The child whimpered softly, tears freezing on her cheeks. Val, who had accompanied them, guided her horse closer. Look at the child, she said quietly. She's half frozen. How much longer can you wander out here alone? If you refuse Mance's offer, you'll starve or the others will find you. The mention of the others made one of the weeping wolves shudder visibly. Corric looked back at his small band, starved faces, half of them children or elders. Jon watched him wrestle with pride. Finally, Corric lowered his spear a fraction. We'll not be put in chains. You won't be, Jon said. But you'll have to answer for the man killed. His family deserves some justice. Perhaps we can find a way to repay what was taken. Corric snorted. A blood price? We have nothing to pay. Only this child to feed. Jon met Mance's eyes. An unspoken understanding passed between them. Whether or not formal justice was done, they needed these people to come peacefully or else an entire avalanche could be triggered. Mance stepped forward. Come with us. We'll settle it. If you refuse, you'll die out here. Plain and simple. Corric's fist tightened around the spear, then loosened. Damn you, Mance. I followed you once. Thought you'd lead us to true freedom. Now you're a crow's dog. Fury flashed in Tormund's eyes, but Mance laid a hand on his arm. Say what you will. At least our children will live. A tense silence lingered. Then Corric exhaled, shoulders sagging in reluctant surrender. He gestured for the others to stand down. The weeping wolves lowered their weapons. Val dismounted and offered water to the child. The scene was heartbreakingly human in its fragility, two sides that had been enemies for centuries now forced to cooperate under a fragile banner of necessity. Jon signaled for his men to keep watch. They gathered up the wildlings, guiding them gently but firmly back toward the road. No one put them in chains, but the watchers stayed close, vigilant for any sudden moves. Corric trudged at the front, face set in bitter lines. Tormund, Mance, and Val rode near them, forging an uneasy sense of security. Upon returning to Castle Black near dusk, a throng of watchers and free folk alike turned to stare at the new arrivals. Whispers spread like fire. The weeping wolves, killers of a villager, had been captured but were walking freely. Some black brothers grumbled. One spat on the ground at Corric's feet. Tensions mounted until Jon ordered them all to disperse. The matter will be handled, he said firmly. Return to your duties. He escorted Corric and his people into a side courtyard where a ring of northern men awaited. Thorin Mormont stood front and center. So these are the bastards who killed a farmer, Thorin said, voice cold. Corric squared his shoulders but said nothing. Jon cleared his throat. They admit to taking food. The killing happened in the struggle. We'll question them, ensure that the family of the slain gets recompense. If they can't pay, they'll work, help us with tasks to support the watchers, gather firewood, build shelters, whatever we decide until we feel the debt is paid. A murmur spread among the watchers. Some found it too lenient. Others seemed relieved that the resolution might not be more bloodshed. Thorin Mormont spoke up, that might be fair enough. But if they cause more trouble, I want them gone. Jon gave a curt nod. Understood. Mance has agreed to keep them under close watch. He'll deal with any further insubordination from their clan. Corric growled low in his throat. We need no nursemaid. But he said nothing more, the exhaustion in his eyes telling of a man out of options. Thus it was settled for the moment. The Weeping Wolves, unrepentant but resigned, became the first wildling clan to openly face some form of justice south of the wall that did not end in a hanging or a head on a spike. Many Watchers and Northern men found it difficult to swallow. Sir Alistair Thorne expressed outright disapproval, but with no higher authority challenging Jon's command, he had little choice but to abide. Word of the event spread among the free folk camps. Mance used it as an example of how things worked south of the wall. They have laws, he told his people, but if you abide them, you needn't fear a sword in the night. Some believed him, others scoffed. Still, the flow of new arrivals continued, spurred on by sightings of ominous shapes in the far north. Rangers reported that entire swaths of forest seemed empty, as if wildlife and wildlings alike had fled. Now and then corpses turned up with no sign of who or what had killed them. Jon spent his days in a blur of logistics, diplomacy, and vigilance. He coordinated with Tormund to maintain relative calm in the camps, trying to ensure that no roving band of free folk ventured too far into the local villages without permission. He struggled to keep the Watchers' morale steady. Many felt they were abandoning their sacred vow to keep the wildlings out. Jon reminded them repeatedly that their vow was to protect the realms of men from what lay beyond, and that the others were the truest enemy. Some listened, some grumbled, but discipline held. Occasionally, Mance joined Jon atop the wall, gazing out at the icy expanse. "I never thought I'd stand here as a guest," Mance remarked one cold afternoon, breath billowing in the frigid wind. He wore furs thick around his shoulders, the crow's feathers shining in dull black. "I deserted the Watch many years ago because I believed in freedom. Now I come back, asking permission to pass." Jon studied the horizon. "Life is strange, but if we survive this winter, perhaps we can build something new. Better than endless raids and border skirmishes." Mance's laugh was mirthless. "You dream like a young man, Snow. The day might come when all these forced allies turn on each other once more." His gaze swept across the realm below. "Still, in the face of the others, maybe we can buy enough time for some to live." Jon was silent. He could not predict the future. For now, every day they lasted without a major confrontation felt like a victory. Even so, the uneasy balance could shatter at any moment. The others loomed at the edges of thought, an unspoken horror that might strike without warning. Toward the end of the second week of crossings, as the numbers of free folk on the south side of the wall swelled past thousands, ravens arrived bearing dire tidings from the Shadow Tower. One ragged note, penned by a ranger with shaking hands, spoke of a wildling caravan ambushed during the night. No survivors, or so it seemed, only blood and tracks leading off into the darkness. Another note mentioned sightings of pale figures that vanished when approached, leaving eerie patterns in the snow. The Watchers whispered that the White Walkers had come closer, drawn by so many living souls. Jon read those reports in his solar, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. If the others began openly attacking caravans near the wall, it would send the free folk into a panic. Thousands more still waited beyond the wall, straggling in. Meanwhile, the camps in the Gift were hardly fortified. Could they stand if an army of the dead descended? He penned urgent requests for help to Robb Stark, to the northern lords. "Send more men if you can," he wrote. "The threat grows. We may soon face an army of the dead, and every sword could tip the balance." That night, Jon stood by the brazier in the courtyard, watching fresh snow swirl around him. The cold felt deeper than usual, as if the wind carried the ghosts of lost souls. He caught sight of Mance speaking with Tormund and Val near the gates, their breath turning white in the torchlight. The three of them looked grave. Even Tormund's boisterous laugh was absent. Jon made his way toward them, curious. Val noticed him first. She was dressed in a heavy cloak of white fur, her face pale but determined. "We've just had word from one of our messengers," she said quietly. "Some of the clans near the Milkwater have stopped sending word. We fear they might have been taken." Jon's stomach sank. Taken by the others? Mance's face was somber. "Likely. If so, they may be whites now. Another chunk of the free folk lost to the enemy." Tormund spat. "Then we'd best hurry more of our people south. The longer they stay north, the more likely they become fodder for the dead." Jon considered the backlog of arrivals still waiting beyond the wall. "We'll do our best, but the lines are already stretched." We can only process so many per day to keep order. Then we must risk chaos, Mance said. We'll open the gates wider. The Shadow Tower and Eastwatch must do the same. Once the walkers are upon us, it won't matter how orderly your lines are. We'll all be slaughtered. Jon pressed his lips together. He remembered the day when Mance had come to parley, how he had insisted on smaller increments to maintain control. Now, with the threat intensifying, they might not have time for that caution. It's a gamble, he admitted. But perhaps you're right. Val's face reflected her urgency. Would you rather thousands of terrified free folk stampede the gates unprepared? Or let them slip through in large groups but with minimal checks? Neither option sounded good. Jon ran a hand through his thick hair. We'll have to compromise. We can accelerate the process, but we still need to keep watch for whites, or we risk letting the others slip in. Mance exhaled. Then do what you must. But time is short, Jon Snow. Don't let your caution doom us all. That night, Jon called a meeting of the senior officers of the Watch, along with the representatives of the Northern Lords. They gathered in the common hall once again, the torchlight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jon explained the growing threat, the urgent pleas from Mance to bring more free folk south quickly. The hall erupted with arguments. Some insisted that letting in too many wildlings at once would incite riots or overrun their limited resources. Others said they had no choice but to take the risk. Tempers flared. At one point, Ser Alliser Thorne slammed a fist on the table. We've already risked enough letting them trickle in. Now you want to fling the gates wide? We'll have pandemonium. Our men are not enough to keep order if thousands rush in at once. Ed Tollett, the usually dour but loyal brother, spoke up. We can bolster the guard at the gate, funnel them through in bigger groups, yes, but keep some structure. Not a free-for-all. Maybe double or triple what we're allowing now. That might be manageable, Jon said, seizing on the suggestion. We'll set a schedule. A block of time each day where larger groups can cross. We'll do a quicker inspection, just checking for obvious white signs. The rest, we'll rely on observation in the camps. If anyone shows white-like symptoms, we isolate them immediately. Thorin Mormont grumbled. Easier said than done, Snow. True, Jon agreed. But we'll try. I'd rather handle scuffles in the camp than watch an undead horde swell in number beyond the wall. Reluctantly, the officers assented to this plan. The next day, new guidelines were enforced. The gates opened in extended windows, allowing larger clusters of free folk to pass more quickly. The watchers remained alert for signs of the dead. The lines beyond the wall thinned as caravans and clans filed through in droves. More pitch tents sprang up in the Gift, turning the once sparse region into a sprawling, ragged settlement under the watchful eyes of both the Night's Watch and the Northern Knights. Tensions ran high, but no major outbreak of violence occurred. Jon, however, could not shake the feeling that they were merely postponing the inevitable. Each night, the temperature plummeted and the wind carried strange, mournful sounds. Scouts returned with reports of odd sightings in the distance, shapes moving silently in the snow. Some watchers swore they saw glowing blue eyes on the edge of the forest. Others reported entire camps of wildlings that had vanished without a trace, leaving only footprints that led nowhere. At last, the day came when the gates stood open longer than ever, from dawn till dusk. Thousands more shuffled in, forming a line that stretched far beyond sight. Mance paced the courtyard, barking orders at clan leaders to keep their people calm. Tormund strode among them, telling jokes and tall tales in a booming voice to lighten the mood, but fear lurked behind every jest. Jon posted archers along the parapets, ready for any threat. By dusk, he thought they might have moved a solid portion of the free folk through, more than in all previous days combined. Then the horns blew from atop the wall, 3 blasts echoing in the twilight. The chatter in the yard died instantly. Men froze. Women and children clutched each other. The watchers on the walls shouted down, 3 blasts, White Walkers. The dreaded signal, seldom heard in living memory, resounded again, sending a chill through every soul. Jon looked at Mance, whose face had gone pale. The king beyond the wall whispered, "They're here." The yard erupted into motion. Black brothers scrambled to close the gates, though countless free folk were still outside. The clank of chains and the groan of wood filled the air as the portcullis descended. People screamed, some trying to push forward, others to flee. Chaos threatened to consume them all. Jon rushed to the gatehouse, shouting for order. "Archers to the walls. Form lines at the gate, keep it from being overrun. We can't let panic break us." His own heart hammered, but he steeled himself. This was what they had prepared for, or so he hoped. High above, watchers called frantic warnings. Shapes were visible in the snow beyond the straggling lines of wildlings. Dark shapes moving unnaturally fast. The last few free folk outside hammered on the gate, pleading for entry while the watchers tried to crank it open again. A volley of arrows whooshed overhead, some striking those shapes, but it was too distant to see if any made contact. Jon seized a far eye from a trembling steward, climbing to the parapet for a better view. He focused on the white gloom beyond. At first, all he saw was swirling snow, then gradually he perceived them, the others, pale and tall, eyes glowing like cold sapphires. Their movements were fluid, unnaturally swift, mounted on dead horses whose breath plumed in the icy air. Behind them shambled an army of wights, men, women, beasts with rotted flesh. They advanced relentlessly, unstoppable as a winter storm. The watchers loosed more arrows, but only a few were tipped with dragon glass. Jon bit back a curse. They had so little. He scanned for possible weaknesses. The others were still far enough that the wights behind them looked like a black, shifting mass. But they were coming quickly, and the stragglers outside the gate stood no chance. "Gods have mercy," muttered a black brother beside Jon. Others shouted for fire, for more arrows. Some cried out in terror. Jon forced his mind to focus. "Ready the oil," he roared. "Light the trenches." They had prepared some defenses along the base of the wall, ditches filled with flammable material. Men raced to ignite them, sending sheets of flame across the open ground. The sudden blaze illuminated the approaching undead, revealing their terrible forms. The wights recoiled from the fire at first, many stumbling into the flames and collapsing, their rotted flesh blazing. The others held back, observing with an eerie calm. Then, with an unholy shriek, one of them raised a pale blade, gesturing forward. The wights lurched onward, ignoring the searing flames as though driven by an unseen will. Meanwhile, the watchers tried desperately to haul the final free folk into the gate. Panic reigned in the yard as wildlings already inside scrambled for safety, crowding the courtyard. Tormund bellowed at them to move aside to make room for the last arrivals. Mance stood near the gate, fists clenched, powerless to do more than watch the nightmare unfold. On the parapet, Jon realized the others were not alone. In the distance, colossal shapes emerged from the gloom, mammoths, but not living ones. Their flesh hung in frozen tatters. White mammoths controlled by the walkers. And behind them, silhouettes of dead giants, staggering forward in horrifying silence. If they reached the wall, they might breach it in ways the living could not. A voice behind Jon shouted, "Lord Commander, the fires aren't stopping them. They'll be upon us soon." Jon's mind spun, searching for any advantage. They had to hold them off long enough to seal the gate and keep them from swarming the wall. But the scale of the undead host was terrifyingly large. He cursed the day's extended crossing, so many people out there. Yet he knew waiting longer wouldn't have helped. The others had chosen their moment. Across the courtyard, men scrambled. Ser Alliser Thorne marshaled archers along the ramparts, firing volley after volley. Some wildlings in the yard grabbed weapons, their faces grim. If they had to die, they would do so fighting. Northern knights mounted up, forming a line near the gate to secure the final push of refugees. From atop the wall, one of the watchers exclaimed, "Look! They're circling to the west as well." Jon aimed the far eye and saw more shapes moving along the tree line, trying to flank them. He clenched his teeth. The others meant to surround Castle Black, or at least cut off the approach so none could escape. Fear jolted him, but also a desperate resolve. "Signal East Watch," he shouted. "Send ravens. We need reinforcements from the Shadow Tower, from anywhere. Light the beacons if you must." A steward bolted to obey, terror shining in his eyes. Below, the last wildlings stumbled through the gate. Some watchers hauled them bodily inside, then slammed the gates shut with a thundering crash. The chains were drawn up, the portcullis descending with finality. Outside, the wights flung themselves at the flaming ditches, some collapsing into the inferno, while others clambered over the charred remains of those that went first. The stench of burning flesh wafted into the air. Jon descended the stairs to the courtyard, meeting Mance's stricken gaze. "They're here in force," Jon said. "We must hold. Gather your warriors. We'll need them on the walls." Mance nodded, his face grim. "We'll fight. Free folk don't kneel to the dead." Tormund spat on the ground. "We'll show these pale demons what happens when they face Giant's Bane." Jon clung to that sliver of bravery. "Ser Alliser is commanding the archers above. Thorin Mormont and the Northern Knights will hold the courtyard. Mance, Tormund, Take your people to whichever section of the wall needs them most. Val, help organize the women and children. Get them into the tunnels or cellars. They'll be safer underground. Amid the chaos, men rushed about, distributing torches, oil, and precious dragonglass weapons to those who could wield them. The free folk who had once scorned steel from the south now gripped Lannister-forged swords or battered old axes with trembling hands. A few huntsmen readied their bows. A hush of dreadful anticipation settled over them all as the whites battered at the outer defenses, shrieking in a cacophony of death. Jon drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel shining dully in the torchlight. He made his way to the main gatehouse, from which he could command the defenses. Ghost joined him, silent as a ghost indeed, bristling with an almost supernatural awareness of the danger. Jon thought of his father's words that when the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies but the pack survives. Looking around at the Black Brothers, the Northern Knights, the free folk warriors all gathered in a ring of steel and fire, he realized they were now a single pack, an unlikely one, but bound by the desperate need to live. Outside, the night roiled with shadows and flickers of flame. The others were no longer content to watch. Jon glimpsed one of their pale forms advancing slowly through the firelit gloom, sword in hand. His breath caught. The battle for the realm of men was at their doorstep. Every breath, every decision he'd made had led to this moment, commanding the Night's Watch in an alliance with wildlings with only the grudging respect of southern lords to face a horror that most of Westeros still refused to believe in. He steadied himself. There was no time for fear. Archers, he roared up to the ramparts. Knock and loose on my command. 100 bows creaked. The hiss of flaming arrows soared into the blackness. Their light arced over the outer ditch, momentarily illuminating a swath of undead faces below, twisted, broken, yet animated by some terrible power. The arrows rained down among them, igniting rag-soaked whites and driving steel points into desiccated flesh. Some fell, others pressed on. Jon's voice rang out again, echoing in the freezing wind. Night's Watch, stand to your duty. Free folk, fight for your lives. Drive them back. From behind him, Tormund's booming roar joined the chorus. Mance Rayder raised a spear, leading a knot of wildlings to a side tower. Northern men in direwolf-crested cloaks moved in disciplined lines along the yard, swords drawn, faces grim. Everywhere, tension crackled like lightning. The first wave of whites slammed against the flaming ditch around Castle Black, their shrieks tearing at the night. Some toppled in, bursting into flame, while others found partial gaps to scramble through. The Watchers poured oil down from the walls, igniting them in a cascading curtain of fire. But the whites kept coming, relentless, single-minded in their assault. Atop the gatehouse, Jon shouted for more oil, more arrows. The courtyard rang with the clang of steel as men steeled themselves for close combat should the undead breach the defenses. Ghost snarled beside Jon, hackles raised, ready to defend. Snow swirled, carrying embers and ash in a baleful dance across the night sky. And then, through the licking flames, Jon saw one of the others step forward, untouched by the heat. Its armor shimmered with a pale blue light, frost glinting around it. With inhuman grace, it raised a blade of ice and pointed it at the gate. Jon felt a chill deeper than winter itself. The White Walker's eyes burned with an otherworldly brilliance, seeming to meet Jon's own. In that terrible moment, time stretched thin. All the politics, all the alliances, all the grudges, none of it mattered. Life and death, mortal men against an ancient evil. Jon gripped Longclaw, feeling the Valyrian steel like a living thing in his hands. He locked eyes with the creature, his breath steaming. "For the Watch," he whispered, though no one else could hear. Then the White Walker strode forward, its whites surging behind it. On the parapet, men shouted and loosed more arrows. The night exploded into a maelstrom of flame, steel, and screams. Jon knew the true test had arrived. If they held this night, they might see dawn. If they failed, then winter's darkness would claim them all. He uttered a final command, voice hoarse with resolve. "Stand fast. Stand as one." And so the battle began in earnest, with the wall's defenders braced against the onslaught of the undead, forging a living shield of crow, wolf, and free folk together in the desperate hope that, against all odds, they might prevail.